Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and this video is a direct sequel to the last video. So if you haven't seen the last one already, go watch that one first, or this one won't make any sense at all, right? So, that said, in the last video, we mentioned that the main character is now dead. We killed off John Redbridge, who is the guy we've talked about on this channel more than anybody else, right? The very first episode on the channel is talking about him being created, that he was this kind of a clone, basically, that the old ones had abducted a caveman from prehistoric Earth. They took his DNA, they kind of mutated it in a way very similar to a Marvel character named Gladiator of the Shi'ar, and they created this race called the Eldar. And a group of Eldar came to Earth, and that was around 6000 BC. So the guy that in the current era we call John Redbridge, he's been known by a bunch of names. The players gave him the nickname Bear. Um, at any rate, he finally died, stopping a massive alien invasion. And then the characters went into space. They had his remains in the sick bay of a starship. And when the ship landed on this alien planet, the energy there turned the bear's body into a zombie. He had his memories. Emotionally, he didn't feel the same at all. He was almost the opposite of what he had been before. Right. So, I mean, even me using the word he is not correct grammar there. The zombie version we refer to as Zombear. Zombear is absolutely not the bear. They are completely different characters. They are night and day, right? The bear is kind of like cocky and charismatic and stuff like that. Zombear is the opposite of those. Zombear has no sense of self. He doesn't know his place in the world. He's about as far from arrogant as you could get, right? Um, so a bunch of adventures took place then between then and now. And so now Zombear is on Earth trying to fight crime, having a hard time doing it because he's so much weaker than John Redbridge was. And we talked about that in the last video too. But so he's really struggling. And at any rate, this group of super characters show up. They're a team and they work for an evil mega corporation. They're all wearing black leather outfits with gold pinstripe trim. They beat up Zombear. I mean, really, they try to kill him, but since he's undead, that only sort of kind of works, right? And he was wearing this thing on his costume called an Eldar Spirit Stone. And so they take that and they return to their corporate headquarters. So the player characters are a bunch of random original characters. One of them that is particularly noteworthy, by the way, was played by my friend John. John, the player, because people have mentioned this on some of my old videos I've done. John, the player in real life, is African American. The guy he was playing in this game was half black and half Caucasian, right? So this character's dad was John Redbridge. And then this character's mom was an original character that somebody else had made up in the 90s, and she was a gadgeteer. And then her son, likewise, is also a gadgeteer. So he's super smart. And we said in this game, he looks just like Idris Elba. So he and the other heroes go to this evil mega corporation and they sneak around inside and they figure out what the bad guy's plan is. And so they have built these robots that are like battle droids, basically, right? And how do I want to put this? The battle droids don't know how to fight. They don't have the knowledge. So it turns out with the Spirit Stone, in the moment that John Redbridge died, it made a copy of his mind. But in the same way that Zombear is not really the bear, whatever you give a copy of his memories to will not actually be him. And I know this gets into some kind of more philosophical territory. I could break it down more, but like there's an old Arnold Schwarzenegger movie called The Sixth Day, and it does a amazing job of explaining the difference. How, you are not your clone, for instance, right? That you might be like brothers or something, but you're not the same being. So likewise, if you gave the memories of him to one of these robots, it would not be him, right? And aside from the stuff that you might already be thinking there, the next layer of that is that they are going to use software to restrict the actions of the robots. So if they succeed in what they're doing, the robot will kind of think it's John Redbridge. It will have all of his cumulative, like we said, when he was dying, he felt guilty for everything he'd ever done wrong. These robots would sort of spring into existence preloaded with guilt, right? The robots would miss their loved ones, all sorts of stuff. But then this software kind of digital prison thing that they're going to put the Redbridge mind into would keep him from talking about his feelings or acting on his feelings or doing anything other than being a robot for a soulless corporation, right? So the heroes stop that right away. They go into this glass room where there's sort of like a claw kind of thing with like rubber grippers on it. And it is holding the gem that contains a copy of the mind of Redbridge. And the gem has not been placed on a thing yet in such a way that it would download his mind into the object, right? That has not yet happened because the company studying it just got their hands on it. It is literally alien technology. They need time to study it and figure out how it works before they can actually use the thing. So the heroes were fast enough. They stop all of this from happening. They take the gem back, and then they get attacked by the corporate super team. And the good guys win. The bad guys are defeated. The good guys run away with the gem. So that was a successful, that in and of itself was a game session. And then in the following game session, they go to the smartest character they know that they've met in previous adventures, and that is this guy named Gordon Reed. And Gordon Reed was in this famous adventure from 1989 that involved a completely different alien invasion. And Gordon Reed had built this all black suit of armor that he called Shadow. And Shadow stood for, I want to say, special holographic armor with defensive and offensive weapons, something like that. I can't remember. We did that all the way back in 1989, so I can't quite remember what it stood for. But you get the basic gist. That's what's important. And so he was kind of famous for this. And so while the heroes are here talking to him, the one I mentioned that was played by my friend John, he and Gordon Reed build a suit of armor together. And so this is the armor you see in the top left-hand corner of the channel art that I'm using for this this episode. Which, by the way, if you look close at it, the chest is designed to look like the front of Knight Rider. Hopefully, you can see the shapes there. Um, so I'm a huge fan of this power armor. But yeah, so he does that, and then this was an homage to a DC character named Steel. And whereas Steel had a hammer, um, since the bear had a sword, we gave his son then that was wearing the power armor here a big like glossy black claymore, and then the edge had a laser on it that when it was cutting you, the striking edge was actually like a laser beam. So we thought that was pretty cool. And so this is the our version of the Reign of the Supermen, right? So now we've got the Steel character in play. And then bad guys show up and they um fight Gordon Reed and are trying to steal the gem, the Eldar Spirit Stone. And so the good guys fight him. The new Steel analog character fights him, and John decided to name him Black Bear. So we're like, that's fine, whatever you want, John. Um, so they did that, and then at the end of that adventure, they are talking about whether or not they should put the gem on the power armor, and they decide not to because they have kind of this idea for sort of like a RoboCop version of the bear. Um, but then they're like, yeah, but like the armor doesn't have a sense of touch and so on and so forth. And the bear would be really mad if he couldn't like be with a woman, for instance. Um, so at the end of the adventure, they decide to go see another guy who's another old character from the game called Virtual Man. And so then that's where that adventure ends. So in the following adventure, um, they go see Virtual Man, and he was named after back in the 90s. There's an arcade game called Virtua Fighter. That's where I got the idea from. And so Virtual Man was a scientist named Harold Oliver Graham, which was a joke. Amy Rether came up with that name, by the way. Shout out to her for being clever. So you could write his name like H. Ollie Graham, as in hologram, right? Or Hal O. Graham. Either way, right? I always thought that was kind of cool. But at any rate, yeah, he was the world's like leading expert in holography. And he had created this holographic avatar of himself. And then he could get in a VR rig and control it remotely. And he'd go fight crime. And then he had to, by day, go out and set up these holographic projectors throughout the city. And so it would be something like it had a range of like 1 mile, which is like 10 APs. And they were checkpoints like in a video game. So the idea was he would decide where he wanted to fight crime that night. And so then his avatar would materialize at one of those checkpoints. And then it would run around through the city fighting crime. And it was about as tough as Batman, like in terms of like its physical presence. So if it took enough points of damage, it would de-res. But then he could respawn at the last checkpoint, which I thought was kind of cool. I kind of liked the video game physics being used in something other than a video game. So that was Virtual Man in a nutshell. He was a very popular character in the 90s. And so at this point in our timeline, he's kind of too old to be, doing that sort of thing anymore. But he does create a new hologram and he has a mobile emitter. So the days of having to physically like go attach a thing to the wall and you need them all over the city and so on and so forth, that's all kind of obsolete technology now. And so now he has the mobile emitter. And that projects the hologram around it. So it projects a hologram of John Redbridge, and they attach the Spirit Stone to the mobile emitter. So it has the memories of John Redbridge. but it doesn't quite turn out. It doesn't have the emotions of John Redbridge. It only has, like, it knows what he knew, but it doesn't emote. And they can't really figure out why that is. Part of the reason why it is because then he is our analog to a character from the Reign of the Supermen called the Eradicator. And the Eradicator was sort of an unemotional character, right? So that's part of where we were going with it. But then the other part of it was like I was actually watching this documentary about heart transplants. This is going to sound really weird, but bear with me. But the idea is that like if somebody really loves, say, Mexican food, like I love Mexican food myself, and then they donate their heart to somebody who hates Mexican food, right? After that person has the surgery, they often have a craving for Mexican food. And so scientists are still kind of trying to figure out what's going on there, but they think that part of what makes us, right, is the actually that all the cells in your body are working together and that it's affecting your personality so that your personality would be in body parts that you would never dream had anything to do with personality, right? Well, so that's kind of where we were going with this too, was the reason why the hollow emitter approach wasn't really giving them the John Redbridge they wanted was because it has no cells. You know what I mean? So that was kind of how we were playing it off. And I mean, and Virtual Man was always fallible. He wasn't the kind of character who was like right all the time or something like that. He was a genius, but he was very much a trial and error kind of guy. So we thought that completely fit that character for him to try something and it's not doing what he thinks it would. So he's like, well, I can go back to the drawing board. But so now we've got another guy on the team, basically, right? So then bad guys show up, a different group of bad guys. They steal the Spirit Stone and they have clones. They've gone into where the battle took place, where John Redbridge died. And we said he had this glowing blue blood. And so they've used that and they've created multiple clones. And it takes forever for them to age the clones to adulthood. You know, the clones are getting older. They're in a machine that ages them fast. I don't know how else to word that. But they're not there yet. And so they decide to take one out early and to test it on them to see if it even works. And it actually does. And so of the various characters that we've seen thus far, this one comes the closest to really being John Redbridge. And like I said, you know, the last one didn't have anything organic about him whatsoever, like this one does, you know, so on and so forth. So just, you know, he is clearly then our homage to the Superboy character from the Reign of the Supermen. And he, for those that don't know, that version of Superboy was a clone of Superman, and it gets more complicated. With DC, they threw in other people's DNA and stuff. I always hated that. This guy is only a clone of Redbridge and nobody else. But so, like we had said, John Redbridge was a lot like a Highlander, where he had outlived his loved ones. He had a very painful life, right? And he'd lived for 8,000 years. So at the end of his life, there were sort of two big emotions that he was feeling. One was regret, that he regretted all of his past mistakes and he wished he had been a better man, right? And then the other big emotion that he had was relief, that he had experienced all this loss and his life had been so painful and he was kind of just glad that soon it would be over, right? So as soon as our Superboy analog opens his eyes, and by the way, since Redbridge's nickname was the Bear, they gave This clone, since he was young, they gave him the nickname the Cub, which he hated, by the way. But as soon as he opens his eyes, like, let's start with the relief thing. The last thing he remembers is that all this pain and misery is going to be over. And instead, he realizes he's just at the beginning of his next life. You know what I mean? Like, it really takes the wind out of his sails just right away. So that's like his first moment of consciousness, is his big feeling is disappointment. Like, oh God, they cloned me, you know? Well, that sucks. So he doesn't like that. But everything had come into focus for him about having all this regret. And I don't quite want to word it this way, but I can't think of a better way to word it. He does kind of feel like he's got a second chance now. Like he wished he had been better. And now he's a kid again, right? So maybe he could be better. So it's, when the real John Redbridge died, it was a mixed bag, right? Relief and regret, right? Good and bad. The clone is born, mixed bag, good and bad. Um, but so he starts off and he has kind of an attitude, which again is sort of our homage to Superboy. He's not real happy they cloned him. They didn't ask him if he wanted to be cloned. They didn't even ask Hollow Bear if he wanted to be cloned, and he's here and he looks like a transparent red version of the adult bear, but kind of emotionless. So he wouldn't have really been able to give a adequate response anyways. The guy in the power armor is not even the bear, you know what I mean? He's the bear's son, just fighting the good fight and stuff like that. Well, so then it's time for us to get to the fourth guy. And he is our homage to the cyborg Superman. And in the comics, the cyborg Superman is a villain. And so the players all knew that, but I had taken a lot of liberties with the other three characters. For instance, our homage to Steel was the son of John Redbridge. And in the comics, Steel is, of course, not the son of Superman, right? It's pretty big difference. Um, the Hollow Bear was an homage to the Eradicator, that was a computer program from Krypton, and again, big differences, right? So when they meet Cybear, which is what we called him, kind of just a nickname. These are all just nicknames, really. They didn't immediately assume he was bad, which is good of them. Because I have been known to throw people curveballs if I think they're cheating and acting on information that the player would know that the character would not know, right? So they're very good, and they were very honest about how they should be acting. But he was a villain, and so when finally they start arguing with him and it comes to blows, um, the Hollow Bear, who can shoot red lasers out of his transparent red hands, he shoots Cybear in the face. And so Cybear turns his head and he's got like this red smoke, where just like a Terminator, of course, he's got like this synthetic flesh over top of a metal endoskeleton, right? So it blows the flesh off of half of his face, but he has his head turned. And then when he turns his head to look at the party, they're all shocked because what they see underneath the flesh is actually the arch enemy of the bear, which was Necron. And just as the real bear is now dead, the real Necron is dead too. So they are very confused what the deal is with this guy. And he refers to himself, the first time he's talking about himself, he refers to himself as what was it? The Necron Ursus composite. And So he's not actually referring to himself as Necron. And also, I should explain something really quick. And this is a reference to there's an adventure from Friday the 13th of September of 1991, which is the one with the continuum, and they're at a store called Swallens, and the store burns down, yada yada. At any rate, in that adventure, we had talked about how Necron was kind of like a demon in a way, and he had been weakened prior to that adventure. So he needed to basically possess a physical body in order to interact with the physical world, right? So he had possessed this body called the Ultrabot, which is there's a long story behind Ultrabot. I'm not going to tell it because I don't want this to be any longer than it already is. But at any rate, that's the when most people talk about Necron, that's the version they're talking about is when he possessed the Ultrabot body. So when this character turns his head, looks at the party, and you see the metal underneath the flesh, that metal looks like the Ultrabot. So everybody's freaking out. And they had no idea where this guy came from. They still, by the way, don't know where he came from. And since my players listen to this podcast, I can't really talk about that without ruining it for them. So I'm afraid it has to be a mystery for now. But so they all dogpile on him. And like I said, the first time he refers to himself as the Necron Ursus composite. And then the second time he refers to himself, he refers to himself as Necro Ursus. And then the third time he's talking about himself, he refers to himself as Necrosis. And so that ends up being the final name, the sort of official name for the villain. And they beat him and they end up bringing down the building where the fight took place in. And then they sift through the rubble, but they don't find the body anywhere. And they can't figure it out because, like, you know, they would think that there would just be a building laying on top of a metal body that was tough enough they'd find some of that metal at least, but they never did. So, of course, that means Necrosis can return later. And in classic comic book fashion, he had all the powers of the bear and the bear's archenemy, Necron, right? So, really major league villain. And like I say, he's still floating around out there just waiting to make a comeback. And I think that's probably a good point to stop for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. I know we did. We liked playing this. We had, like I said, when we killed off the bear, it was in the middle of quarantine. And honestly, a lot of our players thought they were not gonna, still be around now as of me recording this, right? A lot of people thought that that whole thing was going to end very differently than it did. And obviously hindsight's 2020. And I'm sure for some people it's easy to look back on that era and kind of laugh or something, but um I mean not us. We were freaking out, man. I'll be honest. We were freaking out. We were really scared. I remember I'd bought some stuff on eBay from China. It was knockoff Transformers. And it takes so long for stuff to come from China. And then like when they showed up, we didn't know if we should open them. Like, you know what I mean? It was a lot of um uncertainty, I guess would be the best way to put it, right? We just didn't know what was going on. I think a lot of people didn't know what was going on. But yeah, it was kind of a weird time. Kind of in game and out of game. It was a weird time. But the playing the game without John Redbridge in it at all felt weird. And when we got over our illness, our energy level was really low for months. Our spirits were really low where we were depressed and, so on and so forth. And the game is usually what we play to cheer ourselves up. And so like we couldn't do that at the time. And bringing these guys into the game helped. It did make us feel a little better. So, at any rate, I'm going to wrap this one up. I hope that you liked it. We liked playing it. I hope you liked hearing about it. If so, you know the routine, right? Smash like, check to see if you're still subscribed, and leave us a comment. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll catch you in the next adventure. Bye.